Welcome, viewer. Today I will be explaining the reality sphere, discussing what it is, its purpose, history, variants, and how it's used. Getting right in, and starting with what it is. A reality sphere, in short, is a device capable of holding a whole reality within itself, being infinitely larger on the inside than the outside. But what are they used for, you might ask? Well, its exact purpose depends on the variant of reality sphere in question, but generally it can be used for many things. Examples include waste disposal, storage, running physics and or biological experiments, weapons testing, running software, and various other practical things. And speaking of variants, let's move on to those. The reality sphere has two types, domestic and industrial, both having many subvariants for dealing with very specific tasks. But most of those subvariants look similar to the main type they belong to. So for simplicity's sake, I will only be explaining the average difference between industrial and domestic spheres, so you have a good understanding of what most of them are like. But before I get to the actual differences, I need to first explain how the average domestic sphere is used, what it looks like, and a bit about how it works for context. Starting with the reality sphere itself. Appearance-wise, it's a 6-inch diameter hollow, reinforced glass ball, the inside of which is lined internally with wires and small, highly advanced circuitry that makes it work. It also has a 3-inch specialized electrical plug attached to the bottom, which has a plastic shell around it to keep other internal components, which aren't in the glass sphere, parts safe, and a sturdy plastic handle connected to the plastic shell that goes over the sphere. And functionality-wise, the sphere is just a holding device for the reality inside, and said reality cannot be interacted with directly. Think of it as a removable storage device like a USB drive. So to interact with the reality inside, it needs to be plugged into a machine called an indexer. The indexer, appearance-wise, is a short, cylindrical-shaped metal machine around 3 feet tall and 1.5 feet in diameter, with an adjustable control panel at the front, a movable screen just above said control panel, various ports on the back for additional external hardware like speakers, microphones, etc., and an indentation on top of the indexer with a socket at the bottom of the reality sphere to plug into. This indentation being called the cradle. Functionality-wise, once the sphere is plugged into the indexer via the cradle, the control panel and screen will power up, allowing the user to access the contents of the reality sphere or run whatever software is installed on it. If you are struggling to understand this, simply imagine it as a USB drive being plugged into your PC to access and edit the files on it. And there's an extra, optional third device known as a gateway. Appearance-wise, a gateway is typically 2 feet in diameter and looks like a metal ring with a coil wrapped around it. Said ring is held on to the flat, round, plastic support platform by a pair of clamps at the bottom, and it has 4 supports clamped onto the sides, further securing the ring to the platform. And usage-wise, they are typically plugged into a socket on the back of the indexer via a cable and can be used to add or remove matter from a reality sphere via a wormhole. But its maximum transfer capacity and what it can actually allow through is limited by its size, safety systems, and the rubber banding effect, resisting the things going in. The aforementioned safety systems are also hard-coded into the gateway itself to prevent the user from extracting potentially hazardous or outright dangerous things such as molten rock, diseases, hazardous wildlife, explosives, weapons, and other dangerous things. Also, you are probably wondering what the rubber banding effect even is. Well, in short, if something attempts to enter a reality, said reality will naturally try to stop it entering by pushing it back. The more mass the thing trying to enter has, the harder it will push it away, pushing even more so if the thing trying to get in follows different rules of physics. Realities naturally do this to maintain their own laws of physics and to prevent themselves potentially collapsing entirely. Anyway, lastly, how is the reality sphere and indexer even powered? This varies depending on its type, but domestic variants are typically just plugged into the main electrical system of a house via a power cable or a plug, If necessary, they can be directly wired into the electrics of the house itself. And with that, that's the domestic version of the reality sphere covered. We can now compare it to the industrial variant, specifically one for waste disposal as its best example of their differences. Starting with the sphere itself, an industrial waste disposal sphere is much larger, being around 12 to 18 feet in diameter, with a protective metal cage surrounding the hollow glass sphere, said sphere being lined internally with much more wiring and circuitry. The plug on its underside is 6 to 10 feet. The other internal components not in the glass sphere are scaled up. The protective layer outside the plug that protects the insides is made of dense plastic with a layer of rubber on the outside. And they have two large, heavy-duty industrial handles that arch over the sphere, allowing for a crane to insert or remove it from its indexer. This increase in scale is mainly to help the components inside deal with the significantly higher stress they face during operation. Moving on to the indexer. The waste disposal indexer is a hexagon-shaped 36 feet in diameter, 40 feet tall. The control panel and monitor are separate, connected to the indexer via cables, and the cradle socket system on top is scaled up to accommodate the reality sphere. Moving on to the gateways. Waste disposal ones are usually 30 to 40 feet in diameter, have many more denser packed coils, larger supports and clamps that are attached to the ground by large bolts, and their safety system does not allow the same rules as domestic ones. In this case, they allow the vacuum of space to pull things into the gateway, which is used to dispose of large quantities of waste. And due to these gateways being larger, they can allow much more matter through and have far less trouble with the rubber banding effect getting in its way. But why do they have these coils, I hear some of you ask? Well, the coils basically keep the wormhole stable and act as an anchor to keep it open. Without them, the wormhole would simply collapse. But the exact physics that makes them work is complicated and not possible to explain in any meaningful way with modern human science. So we're going to have to skip this and continue. And with that the gateway is covered, we can now move on to the final part of the comparison, how waste disposal spheres are powered. Waste disposal spheres have incredibly high energy demands, so they have their own dedicated power supply. What kind of power supply varies a bit, but most of them rely on a dedicated on-site nuclear power plant to remain operational. With that, the comparison is over. Now we can move on to the history of the reality sphere, which due to its length, I had to summarize down quite a bit. But anyway, now on to the main story. Around 200 years before Amelia was born, massive piles of unrecyclable waste were building up in landfills across the Trelanga homeworld, space to store said waste rapidly disappearing. But one day, a scientist called Korag and his team of researchers who worked in the research and development section of a company that produced heavy-duty industrial equipment and vehicles came up with an idea. The idea was to create something that could get rid of, or at least manage, all the waste and potentially make them lots of profit in the process. So the team came up with several plans and tried what they could, most of the plans being unworkable from the beginning and quickly abandoned, except for two. The first workable plan being an incinerator that was capable of reducing waste to ash, which could be compacted into cubes and stored in landfills, greatly reducing the amount of space the trash took up, but it was cut short after the working prototype suddenly exploded after several tests, killing one of the Korag scientists in the process, and badly wounding several others. The exact cause of the explosion was later investigated by a specialist branch of the police, and they quickly discovered that what went wrong. The actual metal used to create the furnace was low quality and did not meet safety standards, but had been sold as high quality material. The police investigated the actual metal company that sold it and found out that they had intentionally been making products lower in quality, were skipping out on safety checks, and committing tax fraud to save money, which got their owner arrested, charged, and put in prison. And the second workable plan was basically a gigantic tunneling machine, which could be used to make more space for waste. The tunneler would be a 25 feet diameter cylindrical machine with 3 body segments in total, 2 large cone drills on each end, 6 tank tracks surrounding each segment, giant powerful hydraulic movement systems inside to assist with turning, a small nuclear power generator in the middle segment to power the whole thing, and a pilot's cockpit on both ends, allowing for the machine to be operated from either side if necessary. Excluding the drills, the total length of the tunneler came to around 90 feet, but including the drills, it was around 140 feet. The actual construction of this tunneling machine went well, but during the early stages of construction, Korag had an idea. He looked through all of the previous plans, re-evaluating them, until he found one that got his interest. It was known as the Compact Dimensional Storage Box, a container that was bigger on the inside than the outside. Basically, the first ever concept for what would become the reality sphere. They had previously disregarded the idea before as silly and unworkable, but Korag, curious, decided to give it a go to see if he could somehow make it work. So Korag took the design documents home with him and spent several months working on the first reality sphere prototype every night after work in his garage, while also helping his team at work build the tunneling machine. Once the first working prototype was done, Korag brought it into work and showed it to his team, who were still working on the unfinished tunneling machine, but were on break at the time. Appearance-wise, this prototype was scrappy and clearly improvised. Its quote-unquote sphere was a 2-foot glass box held together by a metal frame. The operational components inside were simply taped into place. The internal components that weren't in the sphere itself were wrapped in a trash bag to protect them, and the plug was wired in with a scrap section of cable. Its indexer was just a 4-foot wooden crate with all the components glued to the inside, a desk fan mounted inside to regulate heat, a socket for the sphere was on the side near the bottom, a simple control panel on the monitor system were just attached to the side, and it was powered by a small gasoline-powered generator. The gateway was a 2-foot wide, square metal frame, wrapped with copper coil, held onto a scrap wooden platform by cheap clamps, cables, and nails. It was crudely wired directly into the indexer. His team were initially skeptical of the prototype, but Korag quickly proved its functionality by throwing a glass bottle into the gateway and successfully making the machine spit it back out. The bottle came out distorted, the shape of it having been bent and warped due to the imperfections of the prototype, but it worked, much to the team's amazement. Knowing the machine had potential, his team advised him to present it to the higher-ups of the company and potentially get funding to further refine the design, which is exactly what he did. Korag called some of the investors down to research and development, showed them the prototype, and demonstrated its working, which immediately got their interest. Knowing this machine had great potential, the higher-ups negotiated a deal with Korag and approved funding for the reality sphere, enabling Korag to further develop it. But there was a catch to the deal. Korag had to develop his machine, prove that it could surpass a drilling machine they were already building, and make it marketable. If he failed to do so, his project funding would be cut entirely. But on the other hand, if he managed to do it, he would be rewarded by the company with his own department, led entirely by him, funded by the company, and he would be able to sell reality spheres as long as he gave them 30% of total yearly profits. Taking the deal, Korag immediately set to work refining the design of the reality sphere. Meanwhile, his team continued to work on a tunneling machine, and around 2 weeks later, he created a much more refined version. The cube-shaped quote-unquote sphere was produced to a foot wide, made from one single piece of glass. There were less parts inside the sphere, which were now glued instead of taped. The sphere's operational components were insulated with a proper solid plastic casing, and the plug was now attached directly into it, avoiding the need for a cable. The indexer was a 2 feet wide, 3 foot tall rectangle made of metal, with the components properly bolted inside. It had a 1 foot square-shaped indentation at the top with a socket at the bottom of the sphere to plug it into, and a proper set of controls with a high-quality monitor fixed into place on the front, but the indexer still had to be powered by connecting it to a gasoline generator. The gateway was now circular and made from metal and plastic, but still had copper coils, the new circular shape being necessary to avoid distortions. But despite his obvious improvements, Korag was not satisfied. He knew this alone would not be enough to even get close to what the tunneling machine was capable of. So he decided to upscale its design and attach it to some sort of vehicle, allowing him to potentially clean up even more trash than a tunneler could make room for. And over the next 8 weeks, he did exactly that. Using a decent amount of the funding he was given, Korag purchased a vehicle that was functionally the same as a bulldozer, but looked much more like a quarry truck mixed with a bulldozer appearance-wise, having treads for movement and a blade in the front like a bulldozer, but the general body shape was more like a quarry truck, even having a raisable bed on the back to tip out whatever it was carrying. So Korag modified the vehicle. He greatly increased its maximum speed from 22 to 44 miles per hour, removed the bed's tipping feature entirely, welding it into place, and modified the blade on front to hold a scaled-up 20-foot gateway, which could be adjusted to aim up and down. He also made a scaled-up version of the Indexer and Reality Sphere, mounted them onto the back of the vehicle, and installed the controls and monitor system into the vehicle's cockpit. But as he was building it, he noticed his design had one major issue: powering the actual sphere itself. Due to the system being much larger, it now needed significantly more power. So Korag did some evaluations, calculated how much energy it would need, and concluded that it would need a small nuclear power generator to work. But luckily, the tunneling machine his team were already building used the exact same thing. So Korag used a large percentage of his remaining funds to buy one, installed it into the back of his vehicle, and wired it up. The finished vehicle, including the front blade, was around 72.2 feet long, 28.9 feet tall, and 34.6 feet wide. Deciding to take it for a test run, he took it to a nearby landfill and turned it on. As expected, it didn't start sucking up any trash. Korag then realized he had forgotten to disable the safety settings on the gateway. He turned it off, hopped out, changed some settings, got back in, and turned it back on. This time the gateway violently pulled in anything it could. Letting the machine run for just about 2 minutes, Korag turned it off and checked the control panel just to see how much trash it had pulled in. It managed to suck up 1,248 tons of trash, and upon looking out the front window of the vehicle, he saw it had created a massive pit in the ground ahead of it. It was around 6 times the length of the vehicle itself, 8 times as wide, and twice as deep as the vehicle was tall. Absolutely baffled by the results, Korag recorded the data and went back to research and development to show it to his team. Upon showing them, they were just as surprised as he was. So much that one of them even told the higher-ups about it, and said higher-ups quickly came down in a rush to see what was going on. The higher-ups, seeing the vehicle and the data and how much it had cleaned up, were impressed and congratulated Korag on his work. But now, they wanted to see it compete against the tunneling machine, which was about halfway finished at this point. So Korag would have to wait for the tunneling machine to be built and tested before they could compete. Whilst waiting for it to be finished, Korag took the opportunity to further refine his design of the reality sphere in general, creating what would become the first version of the domestic sphere. This version had an actual spherical reality sphere. The Indexer was now an 8-sided metal pillar with a round indentation on top for the sphere. The controls on the front and the monitor were put on adjustable systems to make it more user-friendly. The internal systems were completely redesigned, making the whole system able to run on household electrics. Korag gave it an advanced processing system, giving it the ability to run programs and software. A reality sphere parts acting as the indexer storage for said programs, and he replaced the copper coils on the gateway with a specialized silver alloy. And around 2 weeks after finishing the refined design, the tunneler was finally completed, and now it had to be tested. So Korag's team took it to a nearby sandstone quarry that was no longer being used, set up the machine in front of a large flat stone wall, set up some monitoring equipment connected to the outside of the tunneler to gather data regarding how much space it has created, spinning up the engine, and began tunneling. Drilling into the wall and tunneling down, the team tunneled at a casual 2 miles per hour for around 30 minutes, which came to about a mile of tunneling, before they decided to return to the surface and check their monitoring equipment's results. The results showed that they had excavated around 170,370.35 tons of solid sandstone, which divided by 30 is 5,679 tons. Meaning for every minute the machine was digging, it had displaced around 5,600 tons of solid rock. Absolutely blown away by the results, the team took the vehicle back to research and development and showed the data to Korag. Caught off guard, Korag realized this machine would need a serious upgrade if he wanted to stand a chance. So Korag swiftly modified his vehicle again, adding a hydraulically adjustable funnel over the front of the gateway that would allow him to better control the suction, hydraulic spikes on the sides to help it keep stable in case of a landslide, and he decided to put a protective cage over the reality sphere system on the back to keep any high-speed trash from hitting it and potentially crippling the vehicle. Once the modifications were done, Korag was ready to compete against the drilling machine. The following day, the higher-ups came down to research and development and explained the terms of how Korag and his team would be competing against each other. All of them would be going to the largest landfill sites on the planet in 2 hours. Such site would be known as Site Null, and they would be observed by the higher-ups as they operated their machines for an allowed time of 2 hours. The winner being decided by the higher-ups based on collected data. 2 hours later, Korag, the team, the higher-ups all made their way to Site Null, the trip taking around 5.5 hours. Once they arrived at the site, both Korag and his team were ordered by the higher-ups to park their machines on the edge of the landfill 200 feet apart from one another, to only start when a siren went off, to have their engines ready, and were informed that a second siren would be used to tell them when to stop. Both parked up, started their engines, and prepared themselves. Meanwhile, the higher-ups made their way up to a watchtower with some monitoring equipment to observe the events that would unfold. Several minutes later, the siren went off. The team immediately nose-dived their tunneler right into the ground, just bordering the edge of the landfill, making their way into the ground at steady pace. And Korag, on the other hand, drove straight out into the landfill, locked his vehicle in place with the hydraulic spikes, adjusted the gateway's position, focused the funnel, and activated the gateway. Immediately, Korag's machine started pulling in anything ahead of it, rapidly carving a long, deep trench into the landfill ahead. About 2 minutes later, Korag turned the gateway off. The trench he had created ahead of him was easily over 350 feet long, 50 feet wide, and 34 feet deep. He then removed the hydraulic spikes from the ground, drove into the trench, swiftly made his way to the end, locked himself in place again with the spikes, readjusted the gateway and funnel, and continued sucking in even more trash, expanding the trench. Korag's tactic was to basically repeat this process every 2-ish minutes, only changing course every 5 to 10 minutes so he could carve out a large square section that could easily be measured. Meanwhile, the team piloting the tunneler decided to dig down at full speed, which was around 10 miles per hour, for a mile, then came back up, making another tunnel right next to the previous one, and to just repeat doing that along the edge of the landfill so that they could create as much tunnel as possible for the trash to go into. Once 2 hours were over, the higher-ups let the second siren to signal the end, and both Korag and the team parked their vehicles back on the edge. Then, the higher-ups gathered the total data accumulated over the 2 hours and decided to send everyone back to research and development while they took the data to their offices and consulted their finance and efficiency teams. The next day, the higher-ups came into research and development, approached Korag, shook his hand, and congratulated him on not only meeting their expectations, but greatly surpassing them. He had earned this department, as agreed. Korag was absolutely overjoyed, but wanted to know what got their favor, so he asked. They basically said the following. Firstly, the tunneler made tunnels 25 feet wide and around 20 miles of tunnel in total. This came out to a volume of around 518,362.78 feet cubed. But his reality sphere, however, managed to clear out a whopping 166,320,000,000 feet cubed of space. He managed to clear out 3,208.5 times more space than the tunneler did. Secondly, his machine overall costed way less to produce than the tunneler did. And thirdly, the technology would make landfills completely obsolete and resolve the planet's waste problem, getting him and the company a large amount of positive press. A few days after this, Korag finally got his own department, hired a small team of semi-experienced staff, and began selling his domestic reality spheres as household computers, which quickly got a lot of interest. As years passed, his department grew rapidly and would go on to sell a very large range of reality sphere systems, ranging from domestic to special industrial variants. Around 7 years after opening his department, Korag earned enough money to purchase the company he worked under and became its CEO. Korag would then go on to expand into other products, such as general appliances, vehicles, tools, components, etc. And then, 22 years later, his company became one of the top 20 largest in the planet's history, sitting just at number 16, right under the pharmaceutical company. And with that, we have covered the reality sphere's history, which brings us to the end of the video. But before you go, I must say something. We apologize for the lack of videos. Making these lore videos takes a while, as Andrew has to do almost everything by himself. The only exception to that being that I, Factual Hat, who is the voice actor, sometimes help him out with the voice acting and the script. And also, he has real stuff to do that takes up most of his time. What exactly I cannot specify for privacy reasons, but you get the general idea. Anyway, if you have enjoyed this video or have any real interest in the videos that we make, like, share, and perhaps subscribe. We would really appreciate it. Mainly because YouTube keeps choking this channel and videos, but that is a topic for another time. Hope you enjoyed. Again, like, share, subscribe, and turn on full notifications. See you next time.